Prior to the Feast of Trumpets this year, we began our study into the book of Joshua, and we actually had our last Bible study that was in Joshua was right before the Feast of Tabernacles. So I thought it would be good to kind of just recap a few things about the background of Joshua as we get into chapters 20 through 24 today. As we've mentioned before, there's a lot of historical perspective that's essential for us to truly understand that's revealed in the book of Joshua, and not only understand history, but also to be able to understand its connectivity to the book of Joshua and the transition for Joshua into ancient Israel's possession of the promised land. From a historical perspective, in Genesis, Israel was born as a nation, was called, and this all comes about as the result of the promises that God gave to Abraham. In the book of Exodus, the actual nation itself was delivered out of bondage in Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea, and after the miracles that God had performed to release them, and then they are given God's holy law. In the book of Leviticus, the nation is actually taught how to worship God in God's view. And we understand that at that particular point in time, they become somewhat sanctified or set apart as a nation for a purpose. And that sanctification or purpose was for them to be a nation for which other nations could be blessed as a result of being obedient to the ways that God wanted to be worshiped. In the book of Numbers, we have a test, and we see that they are numbered as a nation, and there's direction given to them as a wandering nation throughout their journey as a result of their unbelief. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, the law is actually reviewed again and reiterated a second time. And with it comes the assurances that Israel would actually receive the possession that was given to them through the promise of Abraham. They would receive an inheritance. They would receive land that they did not earn, land that they did not actually have given to them by any other authority other than God himself as a result of the promises given to Abraham. What we have in the book of Joshua is as the nation crosses over the Jordan River and takes possession of the land, there is as well the symbolic symbolism of deliverance. If Moses was the deliverer that delivered them out of Egypt, then Joshua gives them the symbol of victory over the lands that they're going to be engaging in. And he also teaches them, as his last parting gifts, a farewell address to ask them to remain faithful. And we see throughout all of this that there is, just like so many things in Scripture, there's a physical application and then there's a spiritual application. And there is a spiritual application for the church. There is a personal application as individuals as we see all of this transpire to a group, to a nation. When we look at just as overall, I guess some other background to recall, there are a couple of different viewpoints as to how this particular book was written. There's a traditional view. This is handed down by many of people in Judaism, that Joshua himself wrote portions of this book. Eleazar the priest and Phinehas his son actually wrote. And there is indications of that throughout the book with pronouns of we and us. And there's evidence after some of the books or some of the events were actually recorded. And we see here that Joshua did make a statement that he actually did write some of this. And then there's another viewpoint that this was something written far later. In fact, there's a more critical viewpoint that's written, that this book was written by Deuteronomists, and Deuteronomists were at the time of the captivity in Babylon, writing back in history for the posterity of the generations that they lived in, as well as for the future, that this was a recap of so many things. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, according to this viewpoint, were all written in Babylon as history from the past. And they were written for the perspective of understanding that Israel deserved their captivity in Babylon because of all the things that are articulated and written in these books that the Deuteronomists wrote. I don't know what's fact or what's fiction regarding that. I find it interesting that when we see here in Scripture, what we see is the possibilities that it could be that there's a little bit of truth possibly in both. But we do know, and as we've gone through here, that the book is divided up into sections, 3 primary sections. We've read through chapters 1 through 12, which are all the victorious conquests that occurred. And in many cases, just as we're going to read today, God is the one that fought the battles. That's the key element. The key element, and that oftentimes when we think about and have read through this, we talk about, well, what can we learn out of this as Christians today as we're reading this book of history? One thing is for sure, if we allow God to fight our battles, we'll have more victories than if we decide to charge off headstrong into battle and find out how inadequate and inept we are. So that is one thing for us to always remember. Another set of chapters, and we'll get into portions of this today, was the tribal inheritance. And that's from chapters 13 all the way through chapters 22, where after the conquest has occurred, and it's interesting that not all of the enemies were removed. But God said, I will remove the rest. And as a result of that, there were lots that were cast to determine which tribe got which area and how much area. And it's interesting that God was the one determining this. And when we think about it, we think about what would happen later in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, when the Israelites wanted a king. Their king, even during this time, was God. And for them to have been disgruntled with their territory or the size of their territory or where their territory was, would have been for them to argue with God. And we see that people that didn't have this weren't entitled to this, but this was a gift given to them, an inheritance, a mindset of appreciation for what they have. But not everyone got the same exact amount of territory, and not everyone got the, let's say, richest land as far as the soil goes. Some places weren't as good as others, but God was the one that determined and set the boundaries. And that's a key thing for us to always remember as well, that God is in control, regardless of what we see going on, even in the crazy chaos of the world around us today. God is in control. And then the last 2 chapters that we'll be looking at today, there is an establishment of the need to be loyal to the covenant. Joshua is going to go to great lengths before he dies to tell the Israelites they need to remain faithful to their covenant. He's remaining faithful to his death. They need to remain faithful to their deaths. Obviously, doesn't take a theologian or someone graduating from a seminary to realize that we need to be faithful to our covenants to the very end as well, and loyal. Just one quick thing, and by the way, there is on the table a handout here that you're welcome to pick up, and it is, each one of the chapters has just a couple of overviews regarding the chapter titles, the chapter, and then some of the observations from within the chapters as well, just so you can keep as well. But one thing that's is interesting as well that we pointed out that I want to remind everyone is that when we look at the actual word Joshua, as it's translated from his Hebrew word, or name rather, to English, Yeshua would be what we would say is Joshua. When you take the Hebrew into the Greek and then that Greek word into English, it comes Jesus. And it's very interesting, and a lot of people get wrapped around the axle about this, but both of them has a root, and they come from the same root, Joshua and Jesus, into the English, the same root word to mean God is my salvation. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think that what we see here because if you recall, if you go back and study your word, you will see that Joshua's initial name was not Joshua. Moses gave him the name Joshua. that he became known as. And Moses was a bit of a deliverer, Joshua is a deliverer, and Jesus is a deliverer. When we think about this, and what the name means is very important. So with that, just as a little bit of a background, and I know I just wanted to spend a few minutes going through that because there's so much that's gone on since we have got back together and started this. I'd like for us to begin by turning over to chapter 20 of Joshua. And because we have so many chapters to go through today, I want to read the first 2 chapters, and then we'll stop and break and let some get some feedback and input of things that you're looking at and seeing here as well. And I'll make some comments along the way. A critical aspect of what we're seeing here in Joshua 20 is the establishment of the cities of refuge. And when we read through this particular chapter, we're going to see that this is a system of government. And we're going to see, just as we look into the administration of what's listed in the statutes and commandments of God, a mind or a window into the mind of God himself and how God would rule. And it's far different from the world you and I live in, and it's far different from what would have been without, and the societies even at that time, without God's setup. So we'll begin in verse 1 of chapter 20, and I'm reading from the New American Standard. It says, "Then the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, Designate the cities of refuge of which I spoke to you through Moses." So we see there's this consistency of chain, "that the manslayer who kills any person unintentionally without premonition may flee there, and they may become your refuge from the Avenger of Blood. He shall flee to one of the cities and shall stand at the entrance of the gate of the city and state his case in the hearing of the elders of that city, and they shall take him into the city of them and give him a place so that he may dwell among them. Now, if the Avenger of Blood pursues him, then they shall not deliver the manslayer into their hands, because he struck his neighbor without premonition or premeditation, and did not hate him beforehand. He shall dwell in the city until he stands before the congregation for judgment, until the death of the one who is the high priest in those days. Then the manslayer shall return to his own city, to his own house, to the city from which he fled. And they shall set apart Kadesh in Galilee in the hill country of Naphtali, and Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, in Kareth Abram, or what's called Hebron, in the hill country of Judah. Behold, or beyond rather, the Jordan east of Jericho, they shall designate Bazar in the wilderness of the plains of the tribe of Reuben, and Ramoth in Gilead in the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan from the tribe of Manasseh. These were the appointed cities for all the sons of Israel and for the strangers who sojourned among them, that whoever kills any person unintentionally may flee there and not die by the hand of the Avenger of the Blood until he stands before the congregation. There's a couple of things that I just wanted to point out before we go on to the next chapter. What we see here is a system of governance, a governance that God established. And as I have on the screen right here, there were regional courts, and they were to deal with capital offenses having to do with manslaughter, as what we would call it today, or as it said here in the English, and I was reading, manslayer. There is the removal of a local jurisdiction as a safeguard to make sure that there wouldn't be any miscarriage of justice, so there wouldn't be blood feuds going on, like we would say, the Hatfields and McCoys. And as a result of this, it was done so that family members also would not engage in vigilantism. We call that today a change of venue in some cases in our court system. So there's a bit of a parallel there. But they were to have this done outside of the place of where something occurred, so that justice in these cities of refuge could be administered appropriately. It's interesting as well, and we'll get to this in just a little bit in the next chapter, and that's why I wanted to put these together, because they kind of go together. These cities of refuge were chosen by God from among where the Levites were living. The Levites, as we're about to see, did not have a specific area given to them in inheritance. They were sprinkled all about. They were sprinkled all about, personally, I think, for a very good reason. And as a result of this, they were to be a part of the procurers of the law of God. They were to know it and to honor it. So these cities of refuge were in the areas that the Levites lived. So there'd be a respect for the law and order. And as a result of that, these cities of refuges were set up so that there wouldn't be anarchy going on. Another aspect of this that's interesting is when you look at the terms that are used here, you have in, I believe it's in verse 3, the Avenger of Blood. This word is also translated as close relative. We have the exact same word used in Ruth chapter 3, verse 9. And that's where Boaz would go to the city gates in order to, he wanted to marry Ruth, but he wasn't the closest of kin to redeem her. And the same identical word, Avenger of Blood, is also translated, however, in that particular case as close relative. So the close relative would be an Avenger of Blood in this case. And the word also, same identical word, is Redeemer in Psalms chapter 19, verse 14. This is all important because based on the law that the Levites studied and were to have honor and make sure it was administered correctly, in Leviticus 24:17 and Numbers 35:16 through 18, there was an obligation in that society for the closest relative to ensure that justice was done. And I think each of us realize that as human beings, even in the churches today, we have individuals that will get very upset about their honor being disdained in the church. And so others in their family will take up for their relatives as well. And here, if you had something so far as someone dying, then there would be the closest of kin making sure justice was done. However, justice would not include vigilantism. It had to be done appropriately and correctly. And these cities of refuge were ways in which this could be accomplished. The gate of the city, which is listed in verse 4, is traditionally looked at as a location where a lot of the trials occurred, where the elders would meet. In fact, we have that in Ruth chapter 4, when Boaz meets there and they do the unique thing of pulling off a shoe and all that kind of stuff, which was to their customs and to their society. But it all occurred at the gates of the city, and that's where the trials occurred. And it's interesting when we see in verse 6 that the individual is to stand as well with the congregation. There's an aspect of that that I think is important, because this leads to the fact that these were to be open and in front of everyone trials, nothing to be done in private and where things could be misarticulated, misconstrued, as we might say. And as a result of that, it was open and it was honest, and it was done in not only physically open, but open in front of the people as well, so that there would be a witness to the fact that this particular trial was fair. And that's just a part of the culture and system that God instructed Joshua to make sure was done once they got into this promised land. Again, this is a window into the mind of God when we think about this. These details are important, because if you and I want to be a kingdom of priests, we need to have the mindset and think the way our Father thinks. And that's important for us to consider when we think about what we're reading. There's also, we see here the sons of Israel, and we see the stranger, and I think that's listed here in verse 9, where these appointed cities were to be for the manslayer or the individual that committed manslaughter, unintentional, but someone died. And so we see here And again, this is very similar to what we're supposed to operate by. The same rules that were put in place for the Israelites were put in place for the strangers that would sojourn among them, that they would have respect for their laws as well. And their laws were to be the laws of God. We see that in Leviticus 19:33 through 34, and Deuteronomy 10, verses 18 through 19. There would not be one set of laws for the non-Israelites and one set of laws for the Israelites. It was the same set of laws for everybody. Equity was a part of this, and equity is a part of the mind as well as the system of government. And I dare say, just a thought, it's very possible that this is the kind of government that we would see in the millennium. Possible. We see here as well that the individuals were to stay, and this goes back into chapter or verse 6, I believe, that they were to stay there until they had their trial. They stood before the congregation, but they were also to stay there until the death of the one who was the high priest in those days. And you know, we think about that, and it leads to the speculation that this was a foreshadow of an atoning effect, a kind of amnesty that was given. And this would be not for someone that was determined was murderer. In other words, they premeditated it, they hated it, the individual, and it was not what we're talking about, manslaughter. That would be a different set of circumstances. But if this happened unintentionally, then they were to stay there in that city until that high priest died. Interesting when you think about many people looking and seeing the parallels that Jesus Christ is our refuge. And there is that he would provide for us until he died, and that we are to remain until he returns in this way of life. And there is a bit of a similarity to him providing amnesty to us as well. Very much of a parallel. Things to, as we read through this, I think that we see physical aspects, and I think we also see spiritual applications. I have here on the screen where these actual cities were. Find it interesting as well. The Jordan River and what is east of the Jordan River, oftentimes called Transjordan. And then you see what was west of the Jordan River. You see 3 cities. You see the 3 refuges or cities of refuge on both sides. And you see north, middle, and south. So that it was not a difficult track to get to either one of these. And there was a bit of, I think, interesting aspects when you consider even the names of these cities, which I know this is rather hard to see, but each one of these cities had names, and the names had significance to why they're selected. Kadesh means sanctuary. Golan means rejoicing. Ramoth means heights or uplifted. When we look at Shechem, its meaning is to shoulder or to put on the shoulder. Basar, it means actually a fortress. And then Hebron is communication or fellowship. Each one of them, I don't think these are coincidences. I think these have significance to why they were selected to be the cities of refuge by God. And Joshua made sure that happened, and as a result of the separation and division of the lands. And it is a form of government, God's government. And we're not talking about government within churches that oftentimes like to say they're God's government. What we're seeing is God's real government. And it's interesting, I think, just as I mentioned earlier, it's a speculative thing, but it's possible that even in the millennium, there may be possibly things that occur just in normal life. And it's possible that we could see these very cities of refuge being put in place. I found it interesting in David's message last week regarding sin in the millennium. You know, things can happen, and we know that it's not going to be a time for which there is no death or no sin. So things can happen, and so as a result of that, precautions are set and put in place. As I said, the chapter 20 and 21 kind of go together. And I'll be honest with you, I'm going to pick a few verses here. There's a lot of detail that's given as we go through this particular chapter of 21. But the reason I wanted to put these together is because what we see is we see the cities of refuge, and then we see the cities of the Levites being articulated here. And it's going to be through 3 different lines or descendants within the tribe of Levite that these particular cities will be articulated or be designated. And these cities, again, just like the land was not equally as far as square footage distributed, the cities weren't equally distributed. They were based on population and based on the size of the tribes. And the whole purpose is so that these people would be able to have respect for the law of God. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 21, then the heads of the households of the Levites approached Eleazar the priest, and Joshua the son of Nun, and the heads of the households of the tribes of the sons of Israel. And they spoke to them at Shiloh in the land of Canaan, saying, the Lord commanded through Moses to give us cities to live in with pasture lands for our cattle. So the sons of Israel gave the Levites from their inheritance these cities with their pasture lands according to the commandment of the Lord. Notice that. God gives the direction, and it was filtered through Moses. And then as a result of Joshua being the extension from Moses, the administrator of the government of God, it's the same thing as God doing it. Verse 4, and then the lot came out from the families of the Kohathites, the sons of Aaron the priest, who were the Levites, received 13 cities, and a lot by the tribe of Judah, and from the tribe of the Simeonites and the tribe of Benjamin. So we see this first line and this first area for which there's going to be cities. Now I have here on the screen as well the list of the 3 different descendants of Levi by tribes, and then the breakout from there. And you see where Moses and Aaron came in through Aram, and then we see Aaron, and we know that Nadab, Abihu had offered strange fire before God. They were basically killed as a result of not being careful with how they worshiped God. And then you have Eleazar, and then who was mentioned here. And then we'll also see Eleazar's son Phinehas come into the picture as well a little bit later. But you see that each one of them had 3 different descendants, and from there 3 different lines, cities given as we go through this. And then there is also Aaron is given, and his sons are given a little bit of extra land as well. Skipping down to verse 6, it says the sons of Gershom received 13 cities by lot from the families of the tribes of Issachar, and from the tribe of Asher, and from the tribe of Naphtali, and half the tribe of Manasseh in Bashan. So we see that, again, there's 13 cities here, different from the cities that were given in verse 4. Verse 7, the sons of Meron, according to the families, received 12 cities from the tribes of Reuben, and from the tribe of Gad, and from the tribes of Zebulun. Now the sons of Israel gave by lot to the Levites these cities with their pasture lands, as the Lord commanded through Moses. Skipping down to verse 13, so too to the sons of Israel, the priests, they gave Hebron, the city of refuge for the manslayer and its pasture lands. And they continued on to verse 27, to the sons of Gershom, one of the families of the Levites from the half tribe of Manasseh, they gave Golan in Bashan, the city of refuge for the manslayers with the pasture lands. Verse 34, to the families of the sons of Meron, the rest of the Levites, they gave from them the tribes of Zebulun and the pasture lands that went with them. Verse 38, from the tribe of Gad, they gave Ramoth and Galad, the city of refuge for the manslayers and their pasture land. So you understand that each one of those cities that we mentioned earlier, and where they're at on the map, around the city of refuge, Levi was given that land, their descendants, based on which line they came from, so that the law of God would be honored and administered in those cities of refuge. Very, very detailed for a purpose, and very detailed for the purpose to make sure that God's law is honored. Verse 41 rather in this chapter, and all the cities of the Levites in the midst of the possessions of Israel were 48 cities and their pasture lands. So they were given 48 cities in the carved out from among the different tribes based on the location of where the city of refuge was, and it was always around the city of refuge that the Levites were given that area. And they were given, as it references in verse 42, the actual pasture land so that they could sustain themselves and they could make sure that they were able to take care of themselves as well. We know that even within the Levitical process, they were given portions of the sacrifices and the tithes that the Israelites would come, in this case, to Shiloh before it's in Jerusalem, but they were also expected to work, and they were to work their land and to provide for themselves as well. And I think there's a lesson in that too. Verse 44 here in chapter 21, as we conclude the chapter, says, "And the Lord gave them rest on every side, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. And no one of their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed to come to pass." And I think that is very important. And one of the lessons we learn out of all of this is the fact that when God says it, it will be done. And if we follow through on what he asks us to do, just as Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." And as a result of that, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And it is a two-way street in this regard. And as a result, even though they didn't do it perfectly, we still see an element of grace here given even by God, because over the course of time, they would still receive rest on all areas and all sides. A rest that is alluded to in the book of Hebrews of the promised land, and a rest that is alluded to regarding the millennium as well. A rest from all the enemies around about you. This last map that I have here on the slide behind us is again showing each one of the areas, the tribes, showing in the little red dots the cities of refuge. So you know exactly where they were relative to the actual cities that were mentioned here in chapter 21 and relative to the actual tribal lands that they were carved out from. So with that, I am going to stop for just a moment and open it up for any thoughts, comments, ideas that anyone else has. Kathy?
Going back to chapter 20, what spoke to me was we see God's heart and his application of justice and mercy. Are we being, quote unquote, cities of refuge for people we meet who are involved in tragedy or need help? Are we those city of refuges for others?
Interesting. Any other thoughts or comments anybody has? David?
So this is kind of going back to what it'll be like in the millennium. So this is just, it's not guaranteed, of course, but a lot of times you kind of feel like Israel was a model for the way God wants things.
Mm-hmm.
And so you think they I don't know if you call it capitalism, but they definitely didn't have socialism. You had to work, you could become rich and poor, but he started people off on a more or less equal footing. You didn't have this huge inequities like you have today with you got, you know, trillionaires on one side and people that don't have any food at all on the other.
Right.
And so I think that'll be similar, why there won't be this huge inequity in wealth in millennium. And I wouldn't be surprised if he reinstituted the years of release, you know, because that was kind of his way of keeping people from, once they on the wrong track financially, to at least get back. And so he didn't prevent them from being poor, but he put some brakes in there to keep people from being uber poor like we have today. And of course, I'm sure they still had some. If you didn't work, for example, it said you wouldn't eat. But anyway, that's some of my thoughts on that. That him dividing up fairly, this whole thing of Joshua kind of gives you his idea of a good way to start the economy.
David?
I was going to say along the same lines, you know, the land was given to each tribe, and it was never sold in perpetuity like we have today. In other words, if you own title to the land today, you have it until you sell it or until it's inherited by your heirs. But in the past, in ancient Israel, it was only sold until the year of release, and you had, you know, X amount of crops, if you will, from the land. That you know, the land was valued based on how much time was left until it reverted back to the original owners, and that way nobody was ever dispossessed totally and irrevocably from the land. So along with what David's saying, I think that would be a great leveler, because nowadays, you know, we have people that own land in perpetuity and benefit from the ownership of that. So, you know, there was that, and that would preclude anyone amassing, you know, great fortune from ownership of land.
Mhm. Steve?
One thing that occurs to me is that Joshua is a forerunner of Christ. He brought Israel into the promised land, physical promise.
Mhm.
Christ will bring everyone into the true promised land. And if Mary, the mother of Christ, was going to call him for supper, she would open the door and yell, Joshua. It's possible that he never in his life heard the name Jesus,
Mhm.
which I believe is Greek, which is interesting because it's probably the most blasphemed name in our society, millions of times a day. It was sort of protected, maybe.
Yeah. Bill?
I'm just curious if anyone else's translation reads differently than the term Avenger of Blood. That's how my translation reads, and that's what you read up there, Neil.
Mhm.
It occurs 3 times, and when I was reading this the first time, I'm thinking, you know, could this maybe be a hired gun? Or, don't laugh about this, but a hired bow and arrow, really, back in those days? Or a hired rock if you're going to stone someone? I mean, that's how I read this initially. It didn't occur to me that it would be like a close relative. Someone would come to avenge your blood, but it could be someone who you've contracted with. If you're the sole surviving family member, perhaps a female or something like that. Just a thought that occurred to me. And then in verse 6, you know, I contrast God's method of judgment here with what we have in place, at least in this country today. We have judges, lawyers, witnesses, police officers, anybody can be bought for a price. 11th hour backroom deals, back scratching, all this kind of stuff that goes on in the name of quote unquote justice. And here we have perfect justice. And if we are to reign as kings and priests with Christ, won't this be a breath of fresh air to carry out his true justice?
Mhm. David, I think you had your hands upset.
Processing here, I lost my thought. I know what it was. The justice spoken of by Paul, you know, he says, don't avenge yourselves.
Mhm.
But he also in previous verses talks about that, you know, the Roman soldiers in essence did not bear the sword in vain. So they were the avengers of blood along those lines, you know, in the New Testament. Not that that was right, wrong, or different, but it's just a difference in the way that happened. And I think mainly it speaks to due process. You know, you've got people who are accused of a crime. Witnesses have to be brought forth, and the crime has to be established, and then the punishment meted out or adjudicated at that point. And in ancient Israel, as they came into the promised land, they didn't have all the system of government worked out. So it was incumbent upon the residents to find justice for the victim or to adjudicate such things with the accused. And it was interesting that nobody can be a hothead and just, you know, take off on their own. There had to be due process.
Ben?
Well, I look at it a little differently. Cities of refuge were put in place for the human element. And so we talk about it being a perfect government, but if it was a perfect government, you wouldn't have to have a city of refuge because everybody would not do vengeance. So I think it shows God's wisdom knowing that, yeah, this is my government. Problem is there's men down there. And so as a halfway, I don't trust for a person to just stay in his own town while he's waiting his trial, because people are going to get, vengeance and vindictive and try to take matters in their own hand, which they shouldn't do, right? And so you've got the city of refuge. So if you fast forward to the millennium, if that is going to be the government, what would be different about it? Why would you not need a city of refuge? And it would be because you have those that were in the first resurrection acting as the judges, us, which would be, hey, we're going to stop things before they happen, right? And so I wonder, in the millennium, would you have a city of refuge?
I agree. I would think you did not.
Yeah. So it's actually an inadequacy, right? Because of us unable sometimes to maintain our composure, vengeance. You killed my sister. You're not going to trial. I'm coming to take matters in my own hands. And I mean that was the only thing that kind of popped out at me.
Well, along those lines, to me, the city of refuge wasn't a law, it was enforcing other laws. His specific way to enforce was an enforcement instead of a specific law, really.
I think it's a good thing. Don't get me wrong, but I think also it shows that God took into consideration our weaknesses as human beings. And also, you talk about, I don't know who it was, just said, Bill said, today policemen could be bought, lawyers. Well, evidently they could back then too. Or else, why would this person need to go to another city to get a fair trial? Right? So it's the human element. It's the human element. That's where we come into play. We mess everything up.
Dave?
And also, I'm just thinking that builds trust in society. When things are properly adjudicated, you have trust in society. You think about the defund the police movement, in some cities today. What does that do? It destroys trust, because theoretically, these people don't trust the police. But if you take them out of the mix, you have essentially lawlessness, which destroys trust.
Steve?
And agree with what Ben said, in the millennium, the judges know all the facts to the nth degree. I don't think there'd be a need for cities of refuge. And the 12 apostles are sitting as judges over the 12 tribes.
Along those lines, there's a prophecy that says that, people will think to do evil, but, they'll hear a voice, this is the way, walk you in it, So in essence, it helps prevent the things that would destroy trust in society.
It's kind of, if you've ever seen the movie that came out a few years ago, The Minority Report, it's one of these sci-fi movies, and they have the ability to see a crime before it took place.
Yeah.
I mean, but on the other thing though, if you won't have city of refuge, but in all actuality, the whole earth will be a city of refuge.
And that brings up another point. Is there any need for Levites in the millennium? That priesthood was destroyed at the death of Christ. It was fired.
Personally, I think you see a change in the book of Psalms from the order of Levi to the order of Melchizedek through Jesus Christ. And I think that will do away with the Levitical part, but we shall see.
One thing I noticed, you never mention prisons at all. Anything about prisons or captives or
Right.
commit a crime, but where are you going to go?
Exactly.
Yeah. I've heard that mentioned many times before, that, when you look at God's government, as outlined here. There is no overcrowding of prisoners where people actually stay and get worse as opposed to rehabilitation and then released. And, so I mean, it's very different. Lance?
The city Kadesh, there are actually 3 cities in Israel named Kadesh.
Mm-hmm.
So 3 sanctuaries. I just found that interesting. Kind of like we might have the same city, Middletown in Ohio, Middletown, Alabama. There were 3 of those. But in the division of the lands by lot, at that time, in modern day Israel, I'm not sure how much of that is actually very good for farming after it was kind of wore out for hundreds of years by the Arabs that had moved in there. I mean, it was the land flowing with milk and honey when they went in there.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Israel today is not, it's pretty arid.
Yeah.
They've had to irrigate a lot of that to really grow things.
Well, they got a lot of stuff from China.
But at that time though, even then, there would have been better lands than others.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as they moved in, the way land was evaluated was always based upon what you could grow or what your livestock could do with it. But having the lots thrown over time, we have the benefit of hindsight, of millennia, that some of these lands that weren't really good for growing anything, they're full of oil, they're full of diamonds, they're full of gold, things that they had no idea about when they first
They were sitting there.
Yeah.
Right.
So the value, there's value no matter where you are, there's value of some sort.
Mhm.
We just may not know it.
Yeah.
We're just not aware.
Great. All very good comments. I appreciate all the input and thoughts. I mean, we position and read these things for a lot of reasons. 1, educate ourselves, but 2, educate ourselves to know how to act, and looking again into the mind of God and the way God acts, as well as to hopefully, put us in the right frame of mind and spiritual growth for even in the future. So I appreciate all these comments. But we do have 3 other chapters to go through, so I'm going to read through those. And these all are somewhat connected as well. There is a unique aspect about chapter 22 that I think there's a learning point for each one of us about jumping to conclusions about things. And there's also going to be a recap in chapters 23 and 24 as well. So we'll begin in chapter 22. It says, "Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half tribe of Manasseh and said to them, 'You have kept all that Moses, the servant of God, commanded you, and have listened to my voice in all that I commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days to this day, but have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God.'" And of course, what he's talking about here is that prior to coming in Israel proper, coming into Canaan, there were Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh wanted land that was a part of what we call Transjordan, or on the west or east side of Jordan. But Moses said, if you get this land, you're going to have to send your men with the rest of Israel to conquest the land. God was going to fight for Israel, but Israel had to do something. Just like God fights our battles, but he expects us to do something too. So as a result, they were faithful in what they did as far as making sure that their people or their fighting men went into the land with Israel. And that's what he's referencing here. So going on into verse 4, it says, "And now the Lord your God has given you rest to your brothers as he spoke to them. Therefore turn now and go to your tents and to the land of your possessions, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond Jordan. Only be careful to observe the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of God, commanded you, to love the Lord your God and to walk in all of his ways and keep his commandments and hold fast to him and serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul." I think obviously you probably go book of Deuteronomy and it's almost like is articulating, or Joshua is articulating what Moses had articulated. Verse 6, So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. Now, to the one half tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given a possession in Bashan, and to the other half Joshua gave possession among the brothers westward towards the Jordan, beyond the Jordan. So when Joshua sent them away to their tents, he blessed them, and he said, return to your tents, to your great riches, with very much livestock, and with silver and gold and bronze and iron, and with many clothes. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brothers. And there was a certain amount of equity that's being taught here. You know, there were some things, as we've learned in the previous chapters of the conquest, that God said, don't take a thing from these people as far as what we'd call booty or spoil. And then there were other times when God was okay with it. And they wanted to see if they would follow, testing to see what their hearts were like, because he had had an experience, obviously, with manna with their forefathers. So as a result, he wanted them to share now with the rest of the tribes all of this spoil that they had from their other conquests. The sons of, in verse 9, the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh returned home and departed from the sons of Israel at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan, to go to the land of Gilead, to the land of their possessions, which they had possessed according to the commandment that the Lord had commanded through Moses. Now, when they came to the region of the Jordan, which is in the land of Canaan, the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh built an altar there by the Jordan, a large altar in appearance. And so the sons of Israel heard of it, and behold, the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh have built an altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan, in the region of the Jordan, on the side belonging to the sons of Israel. So this was west of the Jordan River. And when the sons of Israel heard it, and the whole congregation of the sons of Israel gathered themselves at Shiloh to go up against them in war. They were hot. They were going to now go and attack these tribes that, or these individuals that were leaving and going back to the east side of the Jordan River because of this. He goes on to say in verse 13, and then the sons of Israel sent the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and their half tribe of Manasseh into the land of Gilead, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest. It's interesting. If you go back to Numbers 25, there's an episode that occurred where Phinehas actually had a covenant of peace that God recognized because of the zeal of Phinehas. And it's, I think, interesting that in this particular situation, you are seeing the zeal of these individuals of the tribes of Israel being misdirected. And Phinehas, who had directed zeal in a right way in Numbers 25, is the head of the delegation. None of this is coincidence, in my opinion, but he goes on to say, and with him 10 chiefs and one chief of each of the fathers of the household from each of the tribes of Israel, and each one of them was a head of the father's household among the thousands of Israel. So there was a delegation. And they came to the sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, the land of Gilead, and they spoke to them, saying, thus says the whole congregation of the Lord, what is this unfaithful act which you have committed against the God of Israel, turning away from following the Lord this day by building yourself an altar to rebel against the Lord this day? And then they're going to invoke the very thing for which I was referencing with Phinehas, the sin at Peor. Is not the iniquity of Peor enough for us, from which we have not been cleansed ourselves to this day, although a plague came on the congregation of the Lord, that you must turn away this day from following the Lord? If you rebel against the Lord today, he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel tomorrow. If, however, the land of your possession is unclean, then cross the land of the possession of the Lord, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take possession among us. Only do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building the altar for yourselves beside the altar of the Lord our God. And then their response is, or it goes on to say, and did not Achan, which was a part of what occurred at Jericho, and the act of unfaithfulness and the things under the ban, or the things that they weren't supposed to take as spoil, and as a result of him taking it, there was a lot of sin that resulted in punishment to Israel because of that. And then verse 21, he says, and the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh answered, spoke, to the heads of the families of Israel. The mighty God, the Lord, the mighty one, God the Lord. In other words, what we're about to say is truthful. There's a fervence to this that probably we don't understand in English, but they're basically saying, wait a minute, I'm telling you something with great reverence towards God. He knows, and may Israel itself know, that it was in rebellion or if it was in an unfaithful act against God, do not save us in this day. In other words, I guess if there's what we would say, if I'm lying, I'm dying, is what we would say today. Of course, it's in a much more reverential way. Verse 23, and if we have built an altar to turn away from following the Lord, or offer a burnt offering and a grain offering on it, and to offer sacrifices of peace offerings on it, may the Lord himself require it. But truly, we have done this and we're out of concern for a reason, saying, in time to come, your sons may say to our sons, what have you to do with the Lord your God of Israel? In other words, this sectionalism because of the divide of the Jordan. For the Lord has made the Jordan a border between us and you and your sons, Reuben and sons of Gad, and have no portion in the land. So your sons may make our sons stop fearing the Lord. And therefore, we said, let us build an altar, not for burnt offerings or for sacrifices. Rather, it is a witness between us and you, and between our generations after us, that we are to perform the service of the Lord before him with our burnt offerings and our sacrifices and with our peace offerings, so that your sons will not say to our sons in time to come, you have no portion in the Lord. Therefore, we said, it shall come about that if they say this to us and to our generations in time to come, then we shall say, see the copy of the altar of the Lord, which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings or for sacrifices, rather it is a witness between us and you. Far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord, turn away from following the Lord this day by building an altar for burnt offerings and grain offerings and for sacrifices beside the altar of the Lord our God, which is before his tabernacle, speaking of one in Shiloh at this time. So when Phinehas the priest and the leaders of the congregation, even the heads of the families of Israel who were with him, heard the words which the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the sons of Manasseh spoke, it pleased them. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, said to the sons of Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh, today we know that the Lord is in our midst, because we have not committed this, or you have not committed this unfaithful act against the Lord. Now you have delivered the sons of Israel from the hands of God. Then Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, and the leaders returned to the sons of Reuben and Gad and the land of Gilead and Canaan, to the sons of Israel, and brought back word to them. And the word pleased the sons of Israel, and the sons of Israel blessed God, and they did not speak of going up against them and war to destroy the land in which the sons of Reuben, Gad were living. And the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad called the altar witness, for they said, it is a witness between us that the Lord is God. So we see here, as I have here on the screen, obviously this act that was done was viewed as judging by appearance. The one good thing about it is that you do see a zeal for God from others, but you see the moderation of making sure you know the facts before you jump to conclusions. And so many times in life, each one of us are guilty of jumping to conclusions. We see the resolution in all of this being the delegation, we see communication, we see talking, we see seeking out an understanding, which is love, and then a focus on God, a focus on future generations, a focus on being obedient to God, and then taking a stand for what is right. You know, when we look at this, I think this is a very important characteristic that we see that should be a part of us. And we should not be the individuals, even in zeal, to misplace zeal in an inappropriate way and jump to conclusions. We need to get the facts before we jump to the conclusions. I'll stop right here before we get into the last two chapters and see if there were any other comments or thoughts that anybody else had. Rick?
I don't quite understand. They built this altar and they shouldn't have because it was supposed to be the only one in Shiloh. So
They were fearful that they were going to turn that into like the situation with Rehoboam and Jeroboam, where they decided they were going to worship in a different location as opposed to the central location. That was the concern of crisis.
so what was the purpose of even building it?
It was a witness, just to say that if our children later, that, you know, you say that our children aren't good enough because we're on the other side of Jordan, we're not in the Holy Land. I mean, you think about some of the interactivities that go on among churches of God. Well, if you're not with us, then you're not a part of the God. And I see a little bit of a parallel right here.
And is it mentioned anywhere that they went and asked, prayed to God for what to do? I mean, as far as building this, that it was to be a witness, was it their own thinking that they came up with?
You read what I read.
So there's nothing mentioned that they prayed about it?
Nothing that's in the scripture. But it was a sign to them. But they're specific in that we're not going to offer any offerings here. It's just a witness. This is a replica of what it was like, just in case we're not allowed over because you think you're better than us, is basically, I guess, one way of looking at it. David?
So kind of maybe what Rick's getting to is what I was thinking, kind of a poor choice for some kind of symbolism
Possibly.
that could be so easily misunderstood.
Possibly. Lance?
Well, it makes it clear there. God didn't tell them to do it, but they weren't really doing this to God. It was between them and their brothers. It was a witness with them. It wasn't really a God thing. It wasn't a form of worship. Does that answer your question, Rick?
Well, when you put up an altar, I would say that has something to do with worship.
Well, there are lots of altars in the Bible that you don't necessarily sacrifice on them. In many covenants between individuals, they would set up an altar to establish a covenant. So they're making it clear that this doesn't really have to do with God, but with their brothers. This is for you. This is not our way of serving God. Didn't they specify that?
Do we serve man or do we serve God?
I was gonna say there's, this is a little different than that, but there was a management expert that had, you know, principles of proper management, you know, in corporations and that sort of thing. He had as one of his mantras, if you will, seek first to understand and then to be understood. And I think that's kind of the principle that's being applied here when the delegation is sent to the tribes of the East. You know, they wanted to understand before they went to war, and war was averted. You know, a civil war between the brethren, if you will, was averted because they sought first to understand and then to be understood. And, you know, so many times conflict can be resolved in just that way.
Okay. Any other thoughts or comments, David?
And let me add to David's comment there, especially if you're hard of hearing and may not have heard the entire sentence.
Lance?
I don't know that Rick's question's been addressed. Rick,
What's that?
your question, I get the impression you don't feel that your question was addressed.
Why they put the altar up?
28 talks about it. It was just a witness, like what you said, it was just a witness between the groups. It wasn't an altar for sacrifice.
That was actually a very common practice. This would not have been unusual. The rest of Israel, Western Israel was thinking that they were doing it to God.
for their children.
So throughout the Old Testament, you see it a lot where these covenants are set up where they have altars made to the agreements between two. Not every altar is necessarily a covenant with God. There are covenants between individuals as well, or families or countries. Does that make sense?
Well, maybe I need to go back to understanding of what is an altar. Maybe I need to have that defined to understand that this is just a representation and not giving God glory. How do you determine the word altar and have the distinguish between the two?
I have the association of covenant. We have a covenant with God, but we have covenants among men as well. That's my mental association I get from altar is covenant.
But to add to that, I think that, I know the covenants were originally cut, the blood covenants where you mingle the blood of the two people, that sort of thing. And then, eventually it became a sacrificial meal where they would sacrifice an animal and both dine on the animals, the sacrificed animal, okay. And that was not always a covenant, like you say, between God and man. It was a covenant between men, and they were sealing the covenant by doing that. And so the altar would have been a part of that. But in this case, it was more of a representation, a replica, so that they would not be divided, whereas the ones on the west thought it was intended for division. But the ones on the east said, this is just a replica so that we can say, hey, we're part of you guys. And just because we're across the river doesn't mean we're not part of the family.
Steve?
So it's like building a copy of Denny Chimes.
Kathy, I think you had your hand up.
26 says that specifically the people said when they were building the altar, it was not for burnt offerings nor for sacrifice.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was specifically to cement the relationship between those on the east of the Jordan and those on the west, as I see it.
And I think the point of this, I mean, you can argue or I shouldn't say argue, you can have a discussion about they could have selected something other than that. Because when they crossed the Jordan, initially, they put a monument there of stones. And it wasn't that monument was there for purposes of worshiping anything. It was just to memorialize what happened. And that's more what this is. It's a memorial towards the true altar of God. That's truly what I think it is. The bigger part, the part that I think is the most important aspect, is for us to focus on what's being taught in this lesson here. And I think the lesson is whether we're talking about groups of churches, of individuals that are worshiping the same God and everything, that sometimes instead of trying to build the divisions, let's open up the lines of communication and talk with each other. And sometimes we'll find out that some of our differences aren't as vast as we think they are if we communicate, as opposed to, well, they don't meet with us, so they're not a part of the true church of God. And that's an infection that personally I think is a disease within the churches of God today. And it's all because of a lack of communication and talking and feeling superior to one another. Not what God's about. Lance?
Sometimes even when we are talking, we're talking past one another.
Yeah.
We're not even defining our terms. We're using different words or using the same words, and everything is getting all mixed up and confusion just because we don't clarify.
And I think emotion goes a long ways, and that's another component of this. Emotion can lead us to do right things, and emotion, even in a zeal, can lead us to do wrong things. And I think that's another important lesson of this particular episode for us to learn and ascertain and put into our lives. Let's not be so quick to jump. Let's have a zeal for God, but make sure we're doing it the way God wants it done. Because if we go back to the events that occurred in the sin at Peor in Numbers 25, there was a high-handedness against God and the direction that God had given, and Phineas immediately went and did something that God respected and developed a covenant of peace with Phineas's family. And no doubt that's probably this having a right idea of when to act and when not to act was something that Phineas was probably one of the reasons why we see him chosen here, to mediate in an effective way. Ben?
The only thing that I think the communication part is key. I think they probably should have talked about it before they did it. Because I'm getting it, it's kind of like after the fact. But then when you look in verse 10, if I'm looking at this correctly, it says, and half the tribe of Manasseh built an altar of grand appearance. So I wonder, that word grand appearance, it's almost starts to begin this thing that we see sometimes today where you got a church down the street, opens up a new section on the church. Then the other church down the street says, you know what, we need to expand too. So they build another extension. Then the other church down the street says, well, we're going to make ours bigger. And that word grand appearance just kind of steps out to me. It's kind of like, what are you trying to do here? And an altar does have a purpose, okay? And so if you're saying, well, no, we didn't build this to do sacrifices on, well, then why did you build it? Okay, and why didn't you make it grand? Was it to show up this one that God told us to build right here in a specific place? I don't have the answers to it, but it makes you kind of wonder, well, really, sometimes all Satan needs is just a little bit of hint, right? And I think they were trying to practice some wisdom and say, hey, this could open up the door for bad things down the road, And I kind of think that's what they were trying to do, to prevent previous situations from happening again. Am I looking at that wrong?
I don't know. I mean, like I said, I can only go by what's written in the word based on what we see here. I don't know if that was their intentions or not. It appears, based on what we're seeing, with the way they're in verse 22, so reverential towards God. Between, as long as I'm standing here, strike me down if I'm not saying the truth. This was never about that. And I don't think that it was necessarily that. I mean, my translation uses the word large, a large altar. But I mean, it doesn't insinuate, or I don't see from here
Man always has good intentions.
that's true. And it can, like I said, you could probably get into a discussion about you could have selected something differently, but I think that's an issue that is, yes, a part of the story, but I think the bigger part of the story is how you handle conflicts as opposed to necessarily what caused the conflict in this particular case. I mean, what is it Jesus said? There will always be offenses as long as there's people. I guarantee you, somebody's going to offend somebody at one time. How do you handle it? That's the key component. David?
Kind of the law of unintended consequences. Somebody has an idea and a lot of people around it think, well, that's a great idea. And then all of a sudden somebody takes umbrage and decides maybe that's not a good idea.
Okay. Lance?
As we were reading through it, right out of the gate, I was kind of wondering, okay, how sincere are they here? Are they just making excuses? Are they just trying to cover up? Are there mixed motives? But the further we read into it, I just felt more and more assured that they were sincere. Now, am I misdirected? I don't know, but I just felt by the end of the chapter that they were probably sincere in their desires and efforts.
Yeah. In fact, in my Bible, there's a little mark that's verse 22, the mighty one, God the Lord, and it references a note that is a part of what's in Psalms 50, verse 1. But it says here, the repetition of the sacred names gives an oath-like quality to the strong denial of any wrongdoing. I mean, this isn't just like, oh, no, that's not cover up. I mean, this is strong denial. No, that is not what this was about. But again, I think that, to me personally, the bigger part of what we're looking at here is offense occurred, how do you handle offenses? I mean, go back, I believe it's in Matthew 15. You know, if your brother offends you or sins against you, you go to your brother and you talk to him. And then if they don't, then you take a witness with you. And then if they don't accept that, then you bring it before the congregation. And here they were ready to jump to the whole war immediately. And that's not the way this is to be handled. And I think this is the way it's supposed to be handled, where you understand the facts before you jump. And I think that that's a key lesson out of this personally. Okay. Well, let's read on now to chapters 23 and 24. We'll read them together. This is Joshua's farewell address. And then there's going to be just the cleaning up, I guess, if you want to call it that, or how things end at the end of the story. It concludes the whole story of Joshua. Verse 20, or chapter 23, verse 1. And it came about that after many days, when the Lord had given rest to all of Israel from their enemies on every side, and Joshua was old and advanced in years, that Joshua called for all of Israel and for the elders and their heads and their judges of their officers, and said to them, I am old and advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all the nations because of you. For the Lord your God, he who has been fighting for you, see that I have appointed, or appropriated, I should say, to you these nations which remain as an inheritance for your tribes, with all the nations that I have already cut off from the Jordan, even to the great sea towards the setting of the sun. The Lord your God, he will thrust them out from before you and drive them from before you, and you will possess their lands just as the Lord your God promised you. Be very firm then to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you may not turn aside to the right or to the left, so that you will not associate with these nations, these things which remain among you, or mention the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you are to cling to the Lord your God, as you do or have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great and strong nations from before you, and as before you no man has stood before you to do this to this day. One of your men puts to flight 1,000, and the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. So take diligent heed to yourself to love the Lord your God. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of the nations from which these remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you associate with them, and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your side, and a thorn in your eyes, until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Now behold, today that I am going to the way of all the earth, and you know in all of your hearts and in your souls that not one word of these good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All has been fulfilled for you. Not one of it has failed. It shall come about that just as all the good words which the Lord your God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the threats until he has destroyed you from off this land which the Lord your God has given you. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which has commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from off the good land which he has given to you. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and called for the elders of Israel and the heads of their lands of the judges and the officers, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants, and gave him Isaac. And to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. And Esau I gave Mount Seir to possess it. But Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. And then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt, by which I did this in the midst. And afterwards I brought you out, and brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea. And Egypt pursued your fathers in chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. But when they cried out to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and brought the sea upon them and covered them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt, and you lived in the wilderness for a long time. Then I brought you into the land of the Amorites, who lived beyond Jordan, and they fought with you, and I gave them into your hand, and you possessed the land when I destroyed them before you. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, the king of Moab, arose and fought against Israel, and he sent and summoned Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. But I was not willing to listen to Balaam, so he had to bless you, and I delivered you from his hand. You crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho, and the citizens of Jericho fought against you, and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Thus I gave them into your hand. And then I sent the hornet before you, and it drove out the 2 kings of the Amorites from before you, but not by your sword or your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities which you did not build, and you have lived in them, and you have eaten of vineyards and olive groves for which you did not plant. Now therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods for which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The people answered and said, Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord or serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, and who did these great signs in our sight, and preserved us through all the way in which we went, and among all the people through whose midst we passed. The Lord drove out from before us all the peoples, even the Amorites who lived in the land. And I think the reason why the Amorites keep coming up is because they were like viewed as some bad dudes. And here's puny little nations driving them out, but it's God driving them out. And I think that's why the Amorite name keeps coming up so much. Then Joshua in verse 19 said to the people, You will not be able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or for your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after he has done good to you. And the people said to Joshua, No, but we will serve the Lord. I think we've heard this story before. And Moses making the comment, oh, that they had a heart. He goes on to say in verse 22, Then Joshua said to the people, You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen for yourselves the Lord to serve him. And they said, We are witnesses. Now therefore, put away the foreign gods which are in your midst, and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, We will serve the Lord our God, and we will obey his voice. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and made them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up under the oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. Joshua said to all the people, Behold, this stone shall be a witness against you, for it has heard all the words of the Lord which he spoke to us. Thus it shall be for a witness against you, so that you do not deny your God. Then Joshua dismissed the people, each to his inheritance. And it came about after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance, which is in the hill country of Ephraim on the north side of Mount Gosh. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Now they buried the bones of Joseph. Bring Joseph in this. And you remember Joseph had said when the Israelites left, take my bones. And apparently they had not been buried through all of this until they had reached this point, and then they're actually buried in Israel, or what we call Israel today, which the sons of Israel brought up from Egypt at Shechem, and the pieces of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, and one of the 100 pieces of money, and became the inheritance of Joseph's sons. And Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gilbrath, and Phinehas, his son, which was given him in the hill country of Ephraim. So that's how the book concludes. And just as a reminder, you see the land here on the map. This is what land looked like as far as Canaan and the people that were in there. These are the nations that God would drive out. Of course, the Philistines would remain. And as a result of Israel falling short, the Philistines remained and became a problem even to the time of David. And then we see here, just as an outline of what we're looking at after Israel possesses the land, how it has changed and where the tribes are. And as a result of this farewell speech, the state of the land after this occurred. And finally, these are just some life lessons that I put together regarding Joshua. I'm sure you probably could come up with some more. There's so much in this book that I think is more than just history. We started out talking about Jesus Christ's return, and that's why we were studying this. Joshua, Jesus, the name, kind of like what Steve was talking about, and the conquest that would occur in the future. And there's some lessons here from Joshua that I think are important for us. Faithfulness is a requirement for our service. We have to remain faithful. Serving others helps us to prepare to lead others. And we don't get, as they say, the cart before the horse. We have to serve first in order to lead people. Victory occurs when we let God fight our battles, as opposed to trying to address these things and handle them on our own. Guidance from God for our daily living comes from His Word and from the Bible. They didn't have the Bible, but they had the law, and it was reiterated so many times that they were to remain faithful to it, and they were not to turn to the left or to the right. And when we think about it, there were times when you have to make a stand for your beliefs and what's right. And you don't have to worry about what everybody else is doing, but you have to be faithful. And then finally, living for God requires ongoing obedience. It's not just a one-time event. This is something that we do to the very end of our lives. And when we have Joshua being someone that, yes, made some mistakes, just like Moses made some mistakes. But overall, to the very end, the people followed because he served, and he served God, so they followed his example. And then his elders, the people that were with him, they served until they died. And then we see, obviously, in the book of Judges, there comes a time when the people forget these things. And then when they're given freedom, and this is the one thing that I think is important for us to consider, they're given rest on all sides from their enemies. They're given probably more freedom than they ever had before in their entire lives, with an inheritance. And they couldn't handle freedom. And it's resulted in them going back into sin and worshiping and going against what they said they would not do. Here, of course, it was their descendants, their children. But it's important for us, I think, to learn these lessons and hopefully not repeat the same mistakes as others. So I'll stop there. And for any final comments or thoughts anybody has based on those last two chapters. Lance?
Can you back up the slides to that last map that you had up? I've never noticed this before. If you look at the land of the Philistines, if you were to overlay that map over top of modern Israel, you see anything interesting?
Oh, yeah. See the Gaza Strip.
Yep.
Yep, you sure do. You know, there's been many people say that the Palestinians of today are the descendants of the Philistines from the past.
Very well could be.
Any thoughts or comments on this, Dave?
Just Philistine and Palestinian are kind of two forms of the same concept.
Of course, we know the Romans actually gave them that name Palestine, and Palestinians being those that live in Palestine. So that's how that name came into our language. But I mean,
May have the root.
yeah. Bill?
As a general statement, so let me qualify that, you would think that what we have documented as chapter 24 would not even be needed, because these people have lived this. Now they're getting a verbal reminder of it. And I suspect by and large, it's because during Joshua's lifetime of 110 years, there's probably 2 or 3 younger generations right at the very end of his life who didn't live through some of these things and need a verbal reminder of it going forward. So there's their stake in the ground right there going forward. And it's their jumping off point, if you will, after Joshua passes, that says, remember the old ways and cling to them and follow them, because they will carry you through and through and through. And yet we know the outcome of this story. They didn't. They abandoned their ways time and time again. And then they came back to the Lord time and time again. And we know the history of Israel through this.
Well, thank you very much for your interaction today. I hope this is helpful. If nothing else, one of the things that I always like for us to do is, we can have sermons and we can talk about things, but I think sometimes we listen to tapes, we listen to sermons, and we don't spend time just reading the Bible and then stopping and thinking and talking. And that's one of the reasons why I like to try to have these meetings like this, and for the purposes of not just doing sound bites and sermons, but studying the scripture. And there's some sections of scripture we just don't study a lot. And I'll be first to say, I don't think we've ever studied the book of Joshua. And there's so much there. And this ain't the only book. There's